So good afternoon. So this is the parallel session on development and ageing. I'm Anne Rosser and my co-chair is Christian Neri. Just to let you know at the beginning of this session that unfortunately one of our speakers, Juan Botas, was at the last minute unable to make the meeting due to illness. So Christian has kindly agreed to give a very brief outline of the ageing element of this session. And we also have an ECR who has very kindly stepped in at the last moment, Oliver Barclay, who will give a 10-minute presentation at the end of the session.
Thank you, Anne. Welcome to this session. We hope you are going to enjoy it. Yes, I mean, because Juan Botas couldn't make it, I'm going to use 5 minutes just to give you a very short and brief overview about what the seminal approach are for studying the effect of aging in HD. As you can see on this slide, first of all, just like to mention the work of Juan Botas on studying genes associated with lifespan in supercentenarians as a potential source of targets for HD. But there are other approaches. We heard about aging-like effect of mutant Huntingtin in neurons, age acceleration, so to speak, induced by HD. We know about the evidence from Steve Horvath and William Young using DNA methylation clocks. We have these very interesting findings from Karine Merienne about epigenomic alteration and the implication of specific histone marks in specific cells like medium spiny neurons. And there is also the work of Rick Morimoto in the US, where using C. elegans, he's coming up with a very interesting data on proteome aging induced by polyQ motifs. There are other approaches, like the one that we are using in my lab with our collaborators, and it's about studying aging reversal effects, so the inversion of a gene expression compared to what is happening in the course of normal aging and induced by HD and their role in supporting resilience against the disease. I'd just like to say that these two approaches, the one that we have and the one that Juan Botas has, really roots in multiple evidence for the importance of compensatory responses that are there to mitigate the neuronal effect of HD. And the last point I'd just like to make for you to think about is that, of course, the challenge is really to understand what are the relationships between all these aging-like and aging reversal effect to somatic expansion in the context of developing blocking therapies, but also the relationship with the dynamics of cellular compensation in the context of developing restoration, brain restoration therapies. So as a final word, I would like also you to consider keeping an eye on what is happening in the field of anti-aging therapies, because it could be that some anti-aging drugs, because there is this age acceleration that we see in some neurons in HD, could be relevant to fighting Huntington disease. So I think that we should now move to introducing the speaker. The first speaker is going to be Sandrine Humbert, that we all know very well. So Sandrine is a group leader at the Paris Brain Institute, ICM, and she has done really seminal work on uncovering the role of brain development in Huntington disease, and today she's going to tell us more. Sandrine, thank you.
Okay. Can you hear me? Yes? Okay. So it's a great pleasure to be here and to have this opportunity to tell you about what we're doing in the lab. So one of the great mysteries of Huntington disease is the fact that despite the expression of the mutant genes during the entire embryonic life, despite the fact that the mutant protein that is encoded by this gene has altered function in transport and transcription that are central to a cell, despite all of this, the disease has a late onset, okay? And this was something that was striking for our team, and to start to address this issue, what we've done in the past year is to look at the neurodevelopment in Huntington disease. And I will show you in my first part that indeed brain development is altered in HD and how this contributes to the late onset in mouse. And I will also in the second part decipher or give you some result, non-published result about molecular mechanism that can be at the origin of these developmental abnormalities in Huntington disease. So these are only few compelling evidence for an abnormal development in HD. Of course, it's a very partial view of the full literature, showing that the most compelling proof in mice is coming from this study of Mark Mellers that show that if you express mutant huntingtin during a developmental window in mouse and you switch off the expression at P21, then you generate a mouse model of HD. Okay, so it's sufficient to express the mutant huntingtin during development to have signs of HD in the mouse. We heard during this meeting that there are early signs of the disease that could be explained, come from abnormal development, but here we have divergent view about it. But one thing that is sure is that for some of these signs, and this was underlined in this study by this French group, for some of these early signs that are occurring in HD gene carriers decades before the appearance of the first symptoms, the most possible explanation is an abnormal development. So with this idea in mind, what we've done in the lab is to study cortical development. So why cortical development? Because although the striatum is the first region to degenerate in HD, one of the region that is also dysfunctional in HD is the cortex. And there are many studies showing that defects in cortical signaling are causing the striatal degeneration. So the cortex is a 6-layer structure that are assembled in what is called an inside-out manner, meaning that the latest generated wave of neurons will populate the more superficial layer. So this is the time points in mouse. So if 12.5 means embryonic day 12.5, so here you have a wave of neuronal population that is generated and that will form the deep layer neuron. The latest will form the more superficial layer. And for each of these neuronal wave, the cellular mechanisms are similar. So progenitor cells will undergo a massive proliferation. They will then exit the cell cycle, migrate to their final destination, where they will fully arborized. And this is the full maturation of the neuron is occurring during postnatal development. So what we have done in the past is to look at the effect of mutant huntingtin in all these steps, and to make a long story short, what we found is that in fact mutant huntingtin interferes with all of these steps. Not only it regulates the pool of cycling progenitor, it will favor their neurogenic mitosis at the expense of their maintenance in as a pool of progenitor cells. Okay? It interferes with their migration and with their maturation. So at birth, if you use a knock-in mouse animal, a Q111 or Q140 for the mouse geneticist, the brain, the cortical thickness will have a decrease of 10%. So it's not a lot, but still it's there. And all the neurons will not reach their final destination, and you will start with less neurons. So because there is always skepticism about, you can always ask, okay, this is mouse model, what's going on in human? So to address this question, Alexandra Dürr collected fetal samples that are carrying relatively small CAG expansion. So these are human fetuses. They will, in most cases, give phenotypes of late onset disease. And we look at the cortical organization of these gestation week 13 human fetuses, and that you can obviously see, we found many disturbances, including a disorganization of the distribution of the huntingtin that is enriched here at the cortical region. We found abnormal syniogenesis, abnormal mitosis and cell cycle progression, and abnormal progenitors differentiation. So similarly to what we found in the mouse models, we had really a balance between entering earlier in the differentiation process. So, but this is, you have always to remember that it's at the expense of maintaining the cells as progenitors, so you have less progenitor cells. And then at the end, you have an earlier differentiation process. So what does it mean? Okay. Is it relevant to the adult pathology? So to address this point, we move back to the mouse models, and we recently described here 1 week postnatally, a window of dendritic growth abnormalities, neuronal excitabilities defect, and synaptic activities defect. So these are cortical neurons of the upper layer neurons. Okay. Interestingly enough, these defects are observed during 1 week. However, at P21, so 3 weeks after birth, the neurons are exactly like the wild-type neurons. Okay, so the brain is able to self-compensate, to self-correct. Okay, and we're going back to a normal control circuit. So what we did in the lab was to ask, however, okay, because these mice will develop Huntington disease or signs of HD as we can see them in mice. So the question we ask is, we wonder very naively maybe that maybe these abnormalities during 1 week left a mark in the systems. Okay, so what if we help the system not to have these defects? So that's what we did by treating the mice with ampakine, that is a positive AMPA allosteric modulator. And if you do so, you don't see these defects. You still are in an HD knock-in mouse model. You treat them for 1 week, starting at P0. You don't have the defects. They are, of course, normal at P21. And then you wait for 6 months or 8 months, and there is no clinical signs of HD. Okay? So showing that avoiding these defects to occur will delay disease onset. Okay? So in principle, Huntington disease here, at least as far as we can judge from mouse work, is preventable. So now, to go further and to be able to translate this to therapy, of course, we need to know more about the molecular mechanism, and this is an aspect that we've been studying in the lab. So this will be my second part, and the story started with one question of our lab again, still on the neurodevelopment. You may know that this has been reviewed in many studies, that there is the corpus callosum is thinner in Huntington disease presymptomatic mice, but also in human gene carriers. And there have been many mechanisms that are being considering to explain that, and we ask in the lab whether abnormal growth of the neurons that are, of the axons that are forming the corpus callosum could also contribute to this cortical thinning. Okay, so the corpus callosum is formed mostly by axons that are coming from the superficial layer of the cortex that will project to the contralateral side. I told you that in mice, we know exactly at which time point during embryogenesis these neurons are born. So in fact, what we can do, thanks to a technique that is called in utero electroporation, we can label these neurons with a marker, of fluorescent markers. We can label them at the time of their birth. We then wait until the pups are reaching the size we want to look at. And what we find is that and follow their growth. So this is following their growth. So this is postnatally at P0, this is at P4, and we also follow at P21. So this is the control animals, this is the HD animals, and we found that axonal growth is reduced in Huntington disease mice. Okay? So to go into the molecular mechanism, we recapitulate these findings in a cell culture. So we can culture the exact same neurons because the callosal neurons, because we are labeling them with GFP. And indeed, in vitro, if you put these neurons in culture, they will show a reduced axonal growth. So what is sustaining axonal growth in a neuron? It's the growth cone. This is this structure here at the tips of the axon that will allow the migration of the neurons, of the axons. And this growth cone will work thanks to the tight regulation, dynamic regulation, between what is called the microtubule and the actin cytoskeletons. Okay? So we looked at the microtubule cytoskeleton in control and HD growth cone. And obviously, you can see that in the HD growth cone, this microtubule loops here, the central loop that is depicted here in green, is loose. Okay? It's less well organized, and it's obvious if you look at higher magnification, you have much more exploratory microtubule. And many papers have shown that this is in link. This organization will explain, at least in part, the problem in axonal outgrowth. So to further look into this mechanism, to further understand what's going on, we went back to our wild-type Huntingtin, and we look at its distribution in the axonal growth. So this is an axon growth. Okay. This is a growth cone of a growing axon. Following the labels, the actin cytoskeleton, if you remember the little schematic, this is Huntingtin, and this is the loop of tyrosine tubulin. And we found that Huntingtin colocalized with the tubulin, but also with the actin. But to our surprise, because we have been very much involved in microtubule-related function of Huntingtin. In fact, the majority of Huntingtin was colocalizing not with microtubule, but with actin. Okay? Leading us to ask the question of whether, in fact, Huntingtin could directly bind actin. So we collaborated with Ji-Jun Song from KAIST Institute in Korea, and we were lucky to have the full-length recombinant Huntingtin, wild-type Huntingtin. And what we found is the following, is that if you incubate full-length Huntingtin with actin filament, not the monomeric actin filament, then you will have an interaction between the two. So we characterized, and not only Huntingtin is able to bind. Alors, let's see if it works. Yes. Not only Huntingtin is able to bind to these filaments, but it's also able to form bundles of filaments. Okay, so it will assemble the filaments together. So this is an in vitro assay where we just only put actin and Huntingtin, full-length Huntingtin. And I've shown you that in the growth cone, you need to have this bundling of actin filaments for the cell to properly extend its axon. So with Ji-Jun and another group that is involved, that is doing structural work, we show that, in fact, Huntingtin binds actin through its bridge domain. It bundles two actin filaments through the NHID domain. And interestingly enough, Huntingtin will form this very specific structure of actin bundles that show distance between Huntingtin cross-bridge of 36 nanometers and interfilament of 20 nanometers. And this is really, compared to other bundlers, actin bundler that are known in the field, as for example alpha-actinin. This is a specific structure that is assembled by Huntingtin. So in line with the growing evidence, a growing idea in the actin field, we ask the question of what does it mean at the physiological level. So maybe the fact that Huntingtin can assemble these specific filaments, it will confer the actin cytoskeleton a special identity at this site or locally at these sites. So to address this point, what we did was to incubate actin or actin plus huntingtin with cellular extracts and to do a mass spec experiments to see what are the proteins that will be enriched or excluded. And in fact, we find different molecules. Some of them are enriched, much less. A lot of them are excluded when huntingtin is here. Among them, I will illustrate this notion with debrin-1. Debrin-1 is another actin bundler. And what you can see is that debrin-1 and huntingtin in the growth cone are mutually exclusive. Their localization is mutually exclusive. And if you remove huntingtin, the huntingtin will invade, the trebrin will invade the location where huntingtin is normally located. So this is wild type. Now, what's going on in mutant conditions? So another surprise of our study is that, in fact, mutant huntingtin does binds and bundles actin as the wild type. Okay. So the question, of course, we asked was, maybe it binds and bundles actin as the wild type, but maybe it doesn't assemble the same complexes on actin, and the local specification of actin will be changed in HD. So that's what we verified with debrin-1, and indeed with debrin-1, we have differences here where you have a mislocalization of debrin-1 together with its downregulation. So of course, so what we've shown in this series of studies is that not only huntingtin is important to regulate microtubule-dependent functions or even actin-dependent functions, but here what we are showing is that in Huntington disease, the microtubule and the actin cytoskeleton themselves are altered. Okay? So we're still working on the molecular mechanism, but given the importance of these cytoskeletons for the other cellular functions, as for instance transport and transcription, maybe this deficit we can propose that there could be in fact at the start or at the origin of the alteration in several molecular mechanisms. So to conclude, as we heard already yesterday from Alexandra, so what we're doing in the lab is really to trace the path from the early defects through the neurodegeneration. What we want to understand in particular is this window where there is this silent phase. Then we can discuss what the silent phase means. Because in this silent phase, there is compensatory mechanism ongoing. There are also pathogenic mechanisms ongoing, and we believe that identifying being able to discriminate between compensatory and pathogenic mechanism will be crucial to provide people with the right molecule at the right time to treat Huntington disease. So I'm very happy that I joined the ICM. I mean, officially it was this year, but we've been working together since several years now, because this gave me and this gave the people of my lab and the people of Alexandra's lab, I hope, this great opportunity to really tackle neurodegenerative diseases from their molecular aspects to their clinical aspects. And I thank all the lab members that are here for their support in our studies. These are alumni, our ongoing collaborators. I will underline the role of the SUDUS lab for cellular studies, our collaborators for the structural studies and funding agencies, and I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Sandrine, for this very interesting talk, intriguing. I'm sure that there are questions, so we have the time for questions now.
Actually, while people are getting their... Have we got any questions? I'll ask one while we're waiting. So I'm just interested, that was fascinating. Do you think that the changes that Sarah Tabrizi showed in her talk with the slightly small chordate nuclei in the very...
Do I think, I'm sorry, I can't...
In Sarah Tabrizi's talk, she showed a very small chordate nuclei in the HD-YAS patients a long way from onset.
Yes.
In your mind, is that part of the developmental disorder?
Sarah here? No. Obviously, yes, I think it contributes. Because at this stage, I'm not sure, and this is something we can discuss with clinicians, I'm not sure there is overt cell death. And when we say there is a degeneration, in fact, it's there is a volume loss, but the volume loss may be not because of the loss of cells, but maybe the arborization that are starting to degenerate. And we know, again, that if you, the cortical contribution to the striatum during this developmental stage are crucial to maintain and to make the striatum survive normally. So it could well be that there is a developmental contribution.
Okay.
And in addition, there has been studies in striatal cells, human cells, showing that there are developmental defects.
Yeah. So I think we've got a...
So, hi, Sandrine, over here. Hi, Leslie. That was fantastic. I just love your work. What do you think? So it's this yin-yang of what's going on during neurodevelopment, which seems clear that there's things going on during neurodevelopment, and from humans to human IPS, neurons to everything, and then maybe that stabilizes somehow, or, you know, so what do you think the changes from what's going on in neurodevelopment that probably is not somatic repeat instability mediated, right? No. And then you have this phase, and then you have what's going on with the stability, with repeat instability. Like, how do you see that whole progression?
I don't know. That's what I'm studying.
I know.
No, but why I think it's important to study, and that we cannot go further with therapy without taking into account the abnormal brain development, is the fact that, and this is for sure, during development you will have periods of own compensation of the system, and you know the brain can compensate by different ways. It can either use the same pathway, or it can use other pathways. It has been well described in the field of people looking at critical periods of brain development. And when you come with a drug on these systems, you have to be careful, because if you will attack a pathway that has been overcompensated already, it may be even worse. Although, when you just do a brain sample, post-mortem brain sample, you will see that the pathway is up or down regulated. But I think the dynamic of what's going on alongside is clearly important to consider. We cannot not consider it. That's my point of view. And I managed to convince Alexandra, so that's good.
One more question, and then we have to move on.
Wonderful talk. I'm sort of interested in your thoughts around Huntington's actin bundling activity, and whether you think this is more specific to axonal growth and neuronal development, or if it could potentially extend to other processes, because there are many that are dependent on actin remodeling, etc.
Okay. No, maybe I was not clear enough, because this is the first time I'm really showing this data. But in fact, in the actin field, people have, we know that in a neuron, let's say, the way the actin assemble in the growth cone, in the AIS, the axon initial segments, in the axon, in the cell body are different. And the type of actin that are assembled are different depending on the cellular context. So of course, this is something we are checking, is whether, but it will also explain why. If you completely disturb actin in all cells, you would never have a late onset. It may be more subtle than this, because Huntington may have a local role for some actin structure only, or during some times of the differentiation process, etc., etc. So this is something we are looking at.
Okay, so thank you very much, Sandrine, for sharing this data and thoughts.
So our next speaker is Dr. Oliver Bartley. Oliver is a postdoctoral researcher at Cardiff University. He stepped in at the last minute to replace Juan Botas, but with a different topic. So he's talking about transcriptional and epigenetic characterization of human iPS-derived medium spiny neurons.
Thank you. I'd like to thank the speakers, the organisers for inviting me here today. And as Anne has just said, I'm going to be talking about a characterisation of its human pluripotent stem cell MSNs from both an epigenetic and transcriptional perspective. So why should we be looking at this? So as we've heard repeatedly across these sessions, the medium spiny neurons are the most vulnerable cell type to Huntington's disease, and for that reason they are particularly desirable for researchers to continue researching, particularly for those who are interested in disease mechanisms, but also for those of us studying therapeutics. They're an ideal target. And so in order for that work to go well, we need accurate and authentic models of MSNs. And the most authentic cells are the ones that are already in our brains, but they're relatively hard to get to. And so particularly when we're looking at the early stages of the disease progression, so outside of fetal and late stage time points, it's very challenging to get access to authentic human cells. And so we have to look at alternatives. Many people use animal models, but if we want to study the disease within the human context, then we require human cells. And so human pluripotent stem cells are one of the options that we have for studying the Huntington's disease within that context, because they are human, but also because they're pluripotent, and this allows us to differentiate them into any cell type in the body, theoretically, including medium spiny neurons. And so for this reason, human pluripotent stem cell-derived MSNs are being used widely to study Huntington's disease. For all sorts of reasons already. But what we still don't really know and we don't have a full understanding of is how accurately they reflect the authentic phenotype. And so the work I'm presenting today is part of a larger body of work. I'm just going to focus today on the characterization, as I said, of the transcription and the epigenome that we've done so far. And so you can see here that what we've done is we've taken pluripotent stem cells, differentiated them into a medium spiny fate, and then we are comparing them with authentic MSNs collected from the human fetal LGE. And then, if you want to know more about this work and the wider context of it, then I do have a poster which I'm quickly going to promote, B004. And then, so as I said, here I'm going over some single-cell RNA-seq where we've compared some of these MSNs and also over some bulk DNA methylation. So diving straight into the transcriptional profiling. So when we look at the transcriptional, the gene expression of our authentic MSNs, we find patterns similar to those that have already been discussed today. We have good expression of CTIP2 and MICE2, etc. All the normal sorts of things. And when we do this same work looking at our stem cell-derived MSNs, we see a very similar series of genes. So we see wide expression of CTIP2, indicated here by BCL11B. MICE2, we also see FOXP1, FOXP2, and other canonical markers. We're also very pleased to see that we get both subtypes of MSNs. We've just heard about markers SIX3 and EBF1, and you can see that they're present within our populations. And we're also very happy to see that we get transient expression of genes that occur only during small, brief windows of development. So GAD1 and GAD2, for instance, are largely co-expressed around the in the immature phase of development, and so they're co-expressing around the expression of LMO3 here, indicating the pre-MSNs. But having said that, it's not all perfect. So in our protocol, what we found is we have a bias towards the D2 phenotype specifically. Perhaps we need to do something about the SP9 to try and correct for that. It's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just something we need to know and understand if we're using this model, that we do have an overabundance of the D2 MSNs in this case. I'm sorry these slides are a bit blurry. I do promise when I put them in, they weren't. So we then moved on to do an integrated analysis where we brought these cell types together to see how well they compared. And here we find that, and you'll just have to trust me on this, or as I say, go see my poster. We find that there's a lot of overlap in expression for the different subtypes of MSNs, particularly at different phases. And so we were quite pleased to see that our stem cell MSNs really do have a lot of overlap with the authentic MSNs from the primary LGE. Having said that, again, it's not all perfect. And so what you can't see in that table is that several of the clusters are specifically identifying the D2 CLMP positive MSNs. And I think, so cluster 2 and 3, you can loosely see, have a very low contribution from the primary LGE here. And actually they have quite a healthy contribution from our stem cells. And then cluster 15 down here is also our D2 CLMP positive cells, but that one is much more heavily contributed to by our authentic MSNs. And when we look at the gene expression of these different clusters, what we see is that actually there are some differences that we're finding between our cell types. We have, curiously, in our cluster 2, so that's these cells in this orange band here, whilst they are expressing the D2 genes, they're expressing them at a much lower level than the cells over in this cluster. And then if we compare the cluster 15, which has all the authentic MSNs in it, to our cluster 3 here, which has a good expression of D2 genes, what we found is that actually there seems to be differences in terms of maturity and genes that identify how far along the developmental process those cells are. And so again, it's just further indications that maybe we have some aberrant differentiation, but also we're not fully capturing the phenotype correctly here. Moving on, so we also did some DNA methylation analysis to better understand these cells from not a transcriptional perspective, but as I said, the epigenetic perspective. And so in this first comparison, what I'm showing you here are comparisons of the DNA methylation for pluripotent undifferentiated cells shown in yellow and our authentic MSNs and our stem cell-derived MSNs, shown in blue and orange. And so what we see here is that the genes that are demethylated in our pluripotent cultures are largely associated with pluripotent function. And so that's quite good. It means that the genes that we expect to be expressed have open chromatin, allowing them to be transcribed. And similarly, when we look at our primary LGR, so our authentic MSNs, the genes that are demethylated there are largely related to the stratum. And similarly, when we look at our stem cell-derived MSNs, the genes that, again, are more demethylated are related to the stratum. So it seems that from that perspective, we're doing all right. However, when we compare our populations of our stem cell-derived MSNs to our authentic phenotypes, so these three bubbles here are our stem cell-derived MSNs, and the center one is our authentic MSNs. What we find is that the amount of DNA methylation occurring naturally in our authentic MSNs is much greater than in the MSNs we've generated in culture. And curiously, when we look at the genes that are more demethylated in the authentic cells and compare, if we just look at the genes that are more demethylated in our authentic cells, those genes are typically associated with the stratum, with brain tissue, and with neuronal developmental function. And so it's potentially indicating that whilst we have made some progress towards capturing the unauthentic phenotype with these cells, and we do get good gene expression and all these various things, there are still some barriers between them and that authentic phenotype. And so the conclusions for this set of data is that, as I just said, we are successfully modelling some but not all of the authentic phenotype. We do need to do further work to fully understand the differences and maybe see if we can remove some of them. It also just means that moving forwards, those who are using pluripotent stem cell-derived MSNs just need to be a little bit more mindful, particularly right now, of the limitations of those models and also of the techniques we're using. Thank you for your attention.
It was great, thank you, and thank you for keeping to time. Do we have any questions? Again, while people are coming up with questions, can I just ask, what do you think the implications of this work are for people using pluripotent derived MSNs to do screening or understand more about the pathogenesis of Huntington's?
I think that they're still a very useful model. I don't want to make it seem like they're not useful, but I think it's a case of maybe using multiple models, and maybe there's still some value, particularly to animal models and alternative methods, and we probably just need to bring them all together rather than rely solely on something like this.
Here.
I've got a question.
Here, Oli.
Yeah.
Oh, hi.
Nice talk, Oli. So my question is, so you said that you don't reproduce the authentic phenotype or the authentic MSNs.
It's not complete, yeah.
Yeah, and can you identify pathways that are differentially expressed between the authentic and differentiated ones? Specific pathways?
I think we could. I haven't done that work yet. I think it'd be really interesting to see if we can pinpoint that. It might help us identify exactly what we need to do to actually improve that or phenotype. So, yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Do you have any other questions? No. Okay, in which case I'd like to thank all the speakers. That was a fantastic session, and thank you very much. And I think we've now got a coffee break.